But then as we grow, our inner critic isn't protecting us any longer. You start talking to yourself as if you're a good friend rather than your worst enemy. Hi, this is Jim Brown. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. What I'll be talking about today is how we develop an inner critic or an inner critical voice, and what that is exactly, how it happens, and what people can do about it. Many people are very familiar with their inner critic. The injunctions and the things that it tells us to do, the negative voices about how worthy or unworthy we are. Many people are so, that inner voice is so subtle and it's so unconscious that they don't actually recognize it as an inner critic. So when we use the term inner critic, what we're talking about is an internalized voice, so to speak. Not that people are hearing voices, but there's a voice that we internalize, beginning when we're very small, that comes from being shamed, being criticized, being ridiculed. It can come from bullying experiences, negative experiences with our parents growing up, experiences of being embarrassed. And all of those different experiences start to internalize in us this very critical voice. And a lot of times those original inner voices are meant to protect you. Let's say that, in third grade you stand up in class and you answer a question and you get it wrong and people laugh at you. And your inner critic starts telling you, don't ever stand up and answer questions again. Don't do that. And you start to shrink and become very small, very small. But then as we grow, our inner critic isn't protecting us any longer. In fact, it's now starting to work against us. This inner critic, especially when we're not aware of it, can be so subtle and it can actually start to sabotage us. There's a psychologist named Robert Firestone that calls it part of the anti-self system. And I think that's a very good way to look at it, because you might hear, those directions from the inner critic that's telling you, things like, I'm stupid, or I'm not good enough, or, I don't deserve this. And you might think of those things as part of you. But when you can externalize it and think of it not as part of the self, but part of the anti-self system, that's one of the first steps towards overcoming it. And the inner critic is intimately involved in self-sabotage in our lives. It will start to become very active, especially when a person is just about to reach some new level of success or some new plateau, step into a new career opportunity. I've worked with a lot of addicts and alcoholics over the years, and I can't tell you how many times an addict or an alcoholic will go out or relapse on day 89 or day 364. Because just as they're ready to go to a meeting and stand up and take a 90-day chip or a 1-year chip, those little inner critic voices start to talk to them, like reminding them, wait a minute, you're not good enough for this, you can't do that. And that's when people will sabotage themselves. I've seen it happen many times with relapses. And what happens is that voice just kind of starts to creep up and whisper things to you that you're not good enough. People are going to find out that you're a fraud. And that's how that inner critic is also really involved with the imposter syndrome that a lot of people experience. These voices can become so ingrained and automatic that we don't even recognize them. And that inner critic is the voice that you hear in your head when you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror and it says cruel things to you like, oh, what a big fat slob, or you look terrible today. All of those negative voices that people internalize, and they start really developing, an attack on yourself. And sometimes these voices can be with you for years and years and years. They can convince you to give up, or to doubt yourself, or to stop trying, or to not believe in yourself, to not reach out to people, not create friends, not expand opportunities in a career. And they can affect relationships. We can do something we call blemishing, where you're with a partner, maybe you're dating somebody, or you're married to somebody, and you start finding faults with every little thing. It's like, I don't like this about them, and I don't like that about them. And ultimately, it leads to ending a relationship, which otherwise might be pretty healthy, because deep inside you might feel like you're really not good enough or don't deserve that relationship. These inner critic voices have different flavors, so to speak. They have different representations. Sometimes they can be the perfectionist who's telling you all the time that you have to be perfect, and if you're not, you're a failure. They're very black and white. There can be an inner controller who really is trying to control your behaviors, and then it fights with the indulger, and a lot of times there can be that back and forth, that push and pull between the addict mind and the controller. It will say something to you like, you've had a really rough day. Why don't you have a second glass of wine? Go ahead. And then when you do, it's like, are you an alcoholic? You can't control yourself. Those are the types of conversations that happen with the inner critic. There can be an inner taskmaster that's always telling you have to be busy, and if you stop, you're lazy. There's an underminer aspect to the inner critic, and this is the part that attacks the self, that questions your self-worth. It can turn into something we think of as a destroyer, where it becomes really, really harsh and it shames you. And these types of voices often come from very early experiences of deprivation, abuse growing up with parents who are emotionally immature, who can't meet our needs, or who are in competition with a child growing up. There can often be a guilt tripper. This is often a voice, a part of you that's kind of stuck in the past, and it never wants to forgive you for the things that you've done wrong. And in one sense, these voices can try to protect you originally, like in that example of, doing something embarrassing in school, and it tries to tell you, don't ever get embarrassed again, so don't ever show up, don't answer questions. But then you see that it actually starts to reduce your sense of self. And there can also be a conformist voice in there, the one that wants to be liked, needs to be approved of, can be telling you to be a people pleaser, just do whatever you have to fit in. Now, part of the problem with this inner critic is that it also keeps us from being vulnerable. Now, vulnerability is something that many of us fear, and we avoid it like the plague, which makes sense because, when you're vulnerable, you're open to possibly being hurt. If you share, intimate secrets or hopes and dreams, there's the possibility that somebody could shoot them down or laugh at you or shame you for them. But as much as we avoid vulnerability is also the way that we develop deeper, intimate relationships with people. It's the pathway also to human connection. So these inner critics, these inner voices that attack us, they grow out of often very early experiences, and we integrate destructive thoughts about ourselves, and we take in the mean things that voice says to us. Now, something important to recognize about this inner critic is that often when you trace it back in time, you discover that a lot of it is actually not even your voice. A lot of those inner voices that we develop are our parents, sometimes siblings, people that shamed us when we were very young. And those voices will pop up as soon as something bad happens. Your inner critic starts getting real active again. So what we need to do is to learn how to disidentify or differentiate from these inner critical voices so that we can then start to challenge them and then overcome them. One approach you can use to start this process is something called voice therapy, meaning that you first identify your inner critic, you figure out what it's actually telling you. What are the messages? It's telling me I'm not good enough, I'm ugly, I'm dumb, there's something wrong with me, I'm weird, all of that sort of thing. And then you start to rewrite those statements starting with the word you. You're dumb, you're not good enough, you're weird. And you can start to recognize that as something outside of you. Sometimes you actually hear echoes of the person who first said that to you. You start to realize that this is really not the voice's reality, but it's something that you've internalized. You've come to believe that it's your own voice, but it's not. And as you differentiate from this inner critic, you continue to rephrase those statements. You start to talk back to it then with compassion and encouragement and more statements based in reality. You start talking to yourself as if you're a good friend rather than your worst enemy. Lastly, you have to stop acting on the directives of the inner critic, meaning that when you hear this inner critical voice telling you something that's either self-sabotaging or self-limiting, talk back to it, you reassure yourself, you encourage yourself, and then you go ahead and you do those things that it's telling you not to do, or you just don't listen to what it's trying to tell you. The problem with that approach is that sometimes before that inner voice finally quiets, it gets louder. And that's something in behavioral research we call a behavioral burst, meaning that before a behavior is finally extinguished, often it increases. And you have to stick with it and realize that that might happen. Much like when you're doing therapy, you have to realize that sometimes things get better before they get worse. Because when you actually start challenging these inner voices and looking at parts of your experience that you haven't looked at before, it can bring up more feelings. So it's about sticking with it. Keep identifying it, differentiating from it, and acting in ways that are opposite from what it's trying to tell you. That's just kind of an introduction to the inner critic, and I'm curious to hear from people what things your inner critic tells you about yourself, and how have you been able to challenge it, to overcome it? If not, let me know what some of the struggles you have. And if you haven't so far been able to overcome that inner critic, think about what I've said about challenging it and differentiating from it. And if you need some help, find a good therapist that you can work with that can help walk with you through this process. As always, I encourage you to like and subscribe and sign up for notifications so we can let you know when there's more material coming out. And until next time, take care of yourself. Bye-bye.